Let me now introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. We're joined by Mr. Geroid O'Colmain, who is a journalist and political commentator, joining us live from Paris. And we're also joined by Mr. Richard Millett, who is a journalist and political commentator himself as well. And he is also joining us live from London. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us for this edition of the debate. Mr. Millett, I'll start with you. Russia's partial withdrawal has been welcomed by all parties involved, including the Saudi-backed opposition. Do you think the Saudi-backed opposition, which continually issues preconditions, will now step up for peace now that Russia has provided this chance? Mr. Colmain, I'm wondering, that was just a description of how tough things, I would imagine, are going to be, considering the vast differences in opinions that must be around the negotiating table of these talks. Do you think Russia's move by pulling out partially, of course, will help peace?
I think it is a very good move by Russia. I think the Russians are trying to create a sort of a diplomatic space. They're basically trying to create, they're very good at creating mechanisms of negotiation. And I predicted this was going to happen, that they would make a gesture that would then enable, that would strengthen the Assad side in this war, because it would remove the pretext for non-negotiation on the Western side, and so it's actually made it much more difficult for the West to continue to threaten ground troops, to threaten an escalation of the military conflict. I should point out that first of all, your guest made a few statements there which are untrue. Bashar al-Assad is not a dictator. He's a democratically elected president. He has a much bigger and broader and more significant mandate than any of the people waging war against him, including François Hollande, Cameron of the United Kingdom, and Obama of the United States. So he's not a dictator. He did not crack down on a democratic opposition. I was in Syria in 2011. I traveled all over the country a couple of weeks after the unrest, and while there were youths who were reading Facebook, you could read Facebook, wasn't banned, and they were involved in sort of trying to organize Facebook meetings and so on, like the Arab Spring. The uprising in Dara, I think it was 17th of March 2011, was a violent uprising by terrorists who shot policemen. 8 policemen were shot that day, shot dead. And that is what started the war. There was never a problem with democratic demonstrations. I was at one actually in Carfranbel outside Damascus when I was there, and there was nobody was shot. The problem was snipers, unknown snipers, unidentified snipers, who would kill demonstrators and kill policemen as well. And that's what happened in Dara. And that basically provided the pretext for a war of aggression and invasion of the country by NATO proxy forces. All of the forces fighting the legitimate democratic government of Syria are proxy forces of NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And so that is an important thing. So the notion that Assad should step down is not something you can hold if you're going to uphold international law. Under international law, no nation state has the right to demand of another nation state that its government should dissolve itself. That's just nonsense. So if we're going to have civilized discussions in Geneva about the future of Syria, then the opposition, that is to say the NATO countries and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and their puppet leaders, their selected leaders, they will have to accept that international law will have to prevail here. I do think that we need, we have very significant statements from the United States. From John Kerry has now come out and admitted that genocide has been committed. And of course we know that the United States has been providing weapons to the Islamic State. We know that Turkey has been providing weapons to the Islamic State. And we know that the Saudis have been bankrolling them and providing fighters and weapons and a lot more to the Islamic State. So now you have the US Secretary of State admitting that ISIS have committed genocide, and of course that implies that the United States is guilty of genocide in Syria.
Okay, just allow me to come in here, Mr. Colmain. I wanted to put some of your points,
we don't have credible
as you've said there, to Mr. Millett. If you allow me, I just want to keep the conversation flowing.
We need credible international institutions to
Right. Mr. Millett, I'm wondering, President Putin, when he was speaking today, and this goes back to some of the points that Mr. Colmaine there just made, talking about President Assad. It's important to contextualize it, is it not? Because President Putin today, and I'm quoting him, this is according to the AP news agency, said that we see his restraint, his sincere desire to achieve peace, his readiness for compromise and dialogue, end quote. That was President Putin speaking about President Assad of Syria. That's certainly a point of you do not hear ever in the West about President Assad. But if the country is to ever achieve peace, is it not important to contextualize President Assad's position?
I mean, the only democracy in the Middle East is Israel, which isn't part of.
But then, Mr. Millett, if you talk about dictatorship versus democracy, these are all U.S. allied dictatorships that are supporting militancy in Syria. So how do we justify that?
Well, we can't justify it. It's wrong. I mean, there's no right to support Saudi Arabia, which is a brutal dictatorship. But there are dictatorships on both sides. Iran is on the other side, which is another brutal dictatorship. We've got Hezbollah, which is a terrorist group fighting in Syria. Unfortunately,
let me go to Mr. Colmaine, because I wanted to get his opinion on this as well. Mr. Colmaine, how do you feel about what's been said?
Well, with respect to your guest, I don't think I've ever heard such utterly incoherent nonsense in my life. Look, you can't have double standards in international relations if you're going to be serious about peace, if you really want peace. If you want to have perpetual war, then the double standard is what you use. So we can do what we basically consistent saying the West can do whatever it wants. And everybody else can do whatever the West wants, and that's the double standard. And the double standard, of course, is the norm in Western foreign policy, be it European, British, French, American. Everybody else, anybody we don't like, is a dictator. I mean, this is it's puerile, of course, but it tends to work. As the kind of basis of the approach of all of the media stations, and most people kind of apathetically accept it. But that's not a serious international relations. In international relations, you have nation states that have to deal with each other, and you can't go around sort of demanding that some a leader of another state has to step down because you don't like them, or So I mean, the thing about it is that there are different types of democracy as well. The Syrian Arab Republic has its own specific institutions. I would say it's not only democratic, but a lot more democratic because of its inclusion of a very large segment of the working class in parliament, and that's constitutionally mandated. We don't have, for example, a representative of the working class in the French Assembly at all, and it's similar to other European countries where there are no working class interests represented in parliament. So to go around accusing other countries of not being democracy not being democracies is not helpful. I think that we do need I think that the Russians and the Syrians will have to insist on that the United States abandons the double standard, and that they do accept that they've lost this war, and that they do accept as well that they're going to have to pay reparations for the damage they've caused, for the crimes against humanity and the war crimes, which are amply documented. The Syrian government has a massive dossier of all of the crimes that have been committed by the Western-backed terrorists. And I would propose the International War Crimes Tribunal in Kuala Lumpur as perhaps a solution to the juridical problems we're going to have in ending this war. And they have already prosecuted Tony Blair and George Bush in absentia, and have prosecuted them for war crimes and crimes against humanity, because the Hague is not a credible institution, and in any case the United States doesn't recognize any institution outside of their own, so they basically feel that they can operate with impunity.
Okay, Mr. Millett, I want to go back to obviously Russia, and we have been speaking about that, but we're going back to more of the Syrian involvement in Syrian government's actions. But going back to the legacy of Russia so far in Syria, many people say, and this is even in the Western media, mind you, that Russia's move to enter Syria was a brave one. I've read such quotes from many authors in Washington Post, New York Times, etc., saying there was a brave move, it was a courageous move on the part of President Putin, and that the legacy in fighting terrorism has actually been quite good. How do you feel about such statements, and do you agree with them? Mr. Colmain, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about what Russia has achieved or not achieved so far in Syria and its involvement there?
This has been a major achievement for Russia. It's been a huge foreign policy coup for Putin and for the Russian military. They have routed most of the main centers of power of the Islamic State in Syria. They've re-equipped the Syrian Arab Army. They now have state-of-the-art equipment. This is a new modern army. Bashar al-Assad said in 2013 that in an interview that they were going to have to retrain the army, and that was one of the big difficulties, learning how to deal with fourth-generation warfare. And he admitted at the time that they really weren't quite prepared for the type of warfare being waged against them, the media war, the information war, and so on. But now they are. I mean, they have very sophisticated reconnaissance equipment from Iran. They have the S-400 aerial defense system, which is the best in the world. The Israelis, for a long time, were putting pressure on Russia to not to deliver those weapons. Those weapons are there now. Nobody can attack them from the air as long as they have those weapons. The Russians haven't reduced any real major strategic military equipment that they need, and they have already admitted that they can be back within 12 hours should it be necessary again to bring back the troops. This demobilization was also quite impressive because the NATO intelligence agencies were not aware of it, which shows that the Russian military intelligence system is quite secure, and that's very good for Syria because it means when Russia provides the Syrian Arab Army with intelligence, that's not infiltrated by the enemy. So they demobilized in a couple of days, and nobody knew about it, and they can come back again with more troops in 12 hours. It's a good idea because it's better to take those troops. These are highly skilled troops. It's better to take them out of there right now, bring them back into Russia, and they can be redeployed. They may be needed in other parts of the Russian Federation. Remember that the war against Syria is a war also being waged against Russia, and of course the terrorism is spreading into the North Caucasus, into Central Asia. And so Putin is being very, very careful to hold on to those highly trained troops that he needs, and 12 hours would be no problem to reintroduce them. They will not be, the Syrian Arab Army will defend Syria. It has already won this war. If the United States now comes to an agreement on the oil and pipeline issues, which are one of the main issues around this war, that is to say the pipeline from Iran, Iraq, and into Syria and into the Eastern Mediterranean. If the US can come to some kind of an agreement with Russia on these things, then the war would end very quickly and there would be reconstruction. There is already reconstruction happening in Syria, and I think that if the goodwill is there, and the West can just stop funding these terrorists, stop supplying these terrorists, then Syria could be reconstructed very quickly. And the millions of refugees in neighbouring countries and within Syria itself, and this is a very important point to make here, is that the majority of the Syrian refugees are in Syria under the protection of the Syrian Arab Army.
Okay, gentlemen, we just have under a minute left, so I do apologize for interrupting Mr. Colmain. Just want to get both of your final words. Mr. Millett, I want to go back full circle to the first question I asked you again about everybody agreeing for their own reasons that this Russian partial withdrawal is a good thing. So will this further peace in Geneva? I do apologize for interrupting you. I just want to give the last 30 seconds to Mr. Colmain for his final thoughts on that. Mr. Colmain, go ahead.
Just a couple of corrections there. Chemical weapons were used by the rebels. We know that from Carlo Del Ponte, who is a senior official in the United Nations. So Assad did not use chemical weapons against his own people. He did not kill his own people. Most of the crimes of the war, if not all of the crimes, the vast majority, 99% of the crimes, were committed by the Western-backed terrorists. Other point I'd like to make is that the hunger, using hunger as a weapon, famine as a weapon against Syrian people, was used in Medaya, and it was used in Aleppo. And that's something that's very well documented. The Syrian government could not get aid to its people. There was aid there, and the rebels were selling it at extortionate rates.
Okay, Mr. Colmain, I do apologize. The clock has gotten the best of us. I do apologize. Sincerely, we'll have to have both of you gentlemen on for